Ayla was only 19 years old when her life changed completely that spring afternoon. Sitting in the living room of the family winery, a property that had belonged to the Mendoza family for generations, she watched the tense faces of her parents as the impeccably suited lawyer pushed a contract across the antique wooden table. "It's the only way to save the winery," her mother said. Her voice choked, avoiding her gaze. Ayla initially thought it was some kind of cruel joke, but her father's teary eyes left no doubt. The proposal was real, official, and carried a price no daughter should pay. A 75-year-old billionaire sheikh, Tarik ibn Hashid, was willing to pay off all the family's debts in exchange for a young wife. Not an actress, not a model, but an educated, discreet woman from a traditional European family. "He wants someone like you," the lawyer explained with professional coldness, as if he were negotiating the sale of one of the vineyards, and not the future of a young woman. The contract was filled with golden seals, official stamps, and clauses in French and Arabic, but for Ayla, none of it seemed fair. What was there, even without being explicitly written? She understood immediately. She was being exchanged for money, for the winery, for the family's financial survival. For days, Ayla resisted with all her might. She screamed, cried, threatened to run away. But everything was already closed and decided without her true consent. "It's a symbolic marriage," her father insisted in a tone that tried to be comforting, but only sounded desperate. "He's an old man, Ayla. He probably just wants company." She wanted to believe, needed to believe in something to not completely fall apart. The agreement was signed by international lawyers, mediated by a representative from Morocco, and the family received immediate financial protection. The debts were frozen, the winery removed from the auction list, and Ayla lost her freedom in exchange. The flight to Marrakesh was scheduled for the following Saturday, and she left alone, on a silent plane, not knowing if she was being taken to a new life or to the end of the one she knew. The fear that consumed her did not come from noises or explicit threats. It came from the silence in the contract about what would really be required of her, the silence of the parents who avoided discussing the details, and especially the silence she carried in her chest, the silence of someone who had already said yes, but never really wanted to say. When she arrived in Morocco, Ayla was greeted with a pomp that only intensified her feeling of being led to a golden prison. The armored black car that awaited her at the airport had dark windows that prevented the outside world from seeing her, as if she was already being hidden, transformed into private property even before meeting her future husband. The driver, a middle-aged man with an impassive expression, did not exchange a single word with her during the entire journey, increasing the feeling of isolation that had already suffocated her since she left Spain. The luxury hotel where she was taken occupied an entire floor, reserved exclusively for her, with security guards positioned discreetly in the corridors. There were fresh flowers in every room, new clothes in the closet, delicate jewelry on the dressing table, but none of it seemed like a gift. Each item was just a reminder of the commercial agreement that had been made, of the price that had been paid for her youth and her body. During the journey from the airport to the hotel, Ayla looked out the window and saw the city vibrating with a life that seemed to belong to another universe. Children playing in the narrow streets, vendors announcing their products with enthusiasm, colorful tents displaying carpets and spices, palm trees moving gently with the warm desert wind. The normality of the world outside contrasted violently with the turmoil that was going on inside her, and Ayla wondered with a lump in her throat that she could barely swallow. How can the world go on so lightly while I'm going to marry a 75-year-old man I've never seen in my life? That night, alone in the luxurious room, she cried silently until she fell asleep, her tears wetting the imported silk pillow that symbolized the material comfort that had cost her freedom. On the eve of the ceremony, already installed in the Sheikh's palace on the outskirts of Marrakesh, an imposing building surrounded by lush gardens and high walls, Ayla experienced her first moment of true panic when she heard from the assistants, middle-aged women with downcast eyes and rehearsed smiles, the phrase that destroyed her last hope. "He is very eager to meet you, madam." Those words, spoken naturally as they arranged her clothes in the marble and fine wood closet, made Ayla's eyes widen in shock. "Meet? What do you mean? The marriage will be consummated, won't it?" she asked with a trembling voice, feeling the blood run cold in her veins. The women's momentary silence was the answer she feared most. Ayla froze, feeling the ground disappear beneath her feet. She had clung to the idea that the marriage would be just a formality, an agreement of appearances, that the sheik, in his advanced age, was only seeking status or companionship. But no one had guaranteed this explicitly. Not her father, not the lawyers, not the contract she had signed without reading all the clauses. That night, alone in the room designated for her, a suite larger than the house where she grew up, overlooking the gardens illuminated by Moroccan lanterns, Ayla faced the reality she had tried to deny. I may have to sleep with him, and no one will come to save me. The realization fell upon her like a crushing weight, stealing the air from her lungs. Sitting on the edge of the king-size bed, with Egyptian cotton sheets and hand-embroidered pillows, she contemplated the possibilities of escape, but each scenario seemed more impossible than the last. She didn't know the country, didn't speak the language, had no money of her own, and the palace was guarded by security at every entrance. She was completely alone, thousands of miles from home, about to become the wife of a man who could be her grandfather, a man whose intentions now seemed painfully clear. The fear turned into a physical sensation, a constant tremor that started in her hands and spread throughout her entire body as the hours passed slowly, bringing her closer to the moment she dreaded so much. On the morning of the wedding, the palace was immersed in an oppressive silence that was not peace, but absolute control. Ayla woke up early, although she hadn't really slept. She had spent the night in a state of semi-consciousness, tormented by nightmares that mixed with the equally frightening reality that awaited her. The assistants entered the room with the first light of day, bringing programmed smiles and white dresses hanging on their arms, as if that were really a day of celebration and not of sacrifice. The sweet words they spoke only worsened the feeling of imprisonment that Ayla felt. "Today is your big day, Madam Ayla." Big. She wanted to laugh hysterically or scream until she lost her voice, but she remained silent, like a doll that would be dressed and prepared for her owner. The process of getting ready took almost an entire hour, pure silk sliding over her skin like a sentence, a necklace of genuine pearls weighing on her neck like a disguised collar, soft perfume applied behind her neck and on her wrists, as if the aroma could mask the fear that emanated from every pore of her body. When she finally looked in the mirror, Ayla barely recognized herself. The reflected image showed a stunning bride, with impeccable makeup enhancing her Mediterranean features, the white dress with gold details perfectly embracing her young curves, her dark hair arranged in an elaborate hairstyle that highlighted her long neck. She looked like a bride, but felt like a commodity packaged for delivery, a product carefully prepared to please her buyer. Her hands trembled so much that she had to hide them in the folds of her dress when she was led through the endless corridors of the palace, each step echoing like a countdown to the moment she dreaded so much. The main hall, where the ceremony was prepared, shone with an opulence that seemed obscene in Ayla's eyes. Crystal chandeliers, antique tapestries, exuberant floral arrangements, all calculated to impress, to show power and wealth. There were few guests, all men in impeccable suits and neutral expressions, diplomats, ambassadors, lawyers, people who were there out of interest or obligation, not out of affection. None of her family was present, no one to hug her with affection, no one to look at her as a daughter, as a person, and not as a newly acquired asset. In the center of the hall, Tarik ibn Hashid, the groom, waited, standing with a posture that defied his 75 years. He wore traditional Moroccan clothes of fine fabric, a dark turban adorned with a precious stone, and displayed a firm, healthy, and proud presence that contrasted with the fragility that Ayla expected to find in a man of his age. His eyes, dark and penetrating, shone as he saw her enter the hall, but it was not a glow of tenderness or admiration. It was the glow of possession, of the satisfaction of a collector who acquires a rare piece. He was visibly happy, not for the union of souls that a marriage should represent, but for knowing that in a few hours he would have what he wanted so much. A virgin wife, young, exotic in Arab eyes with her European beauty. The previous wives, all older and more experienced, no longer interested him. Tarik wanted novelty, youth, obedience, and had paid a considerable price to obtain them. Ayla swallowed hard, feeling her throat as dry as sand as she walked towards him, each step costing a monumental effort not to collapse or run away. The ceremonialist, a man with a gray beard and official robes, made the formal introductions in Arabic and French, languages that mixed in Ayla's ears like a distant buzzing. She responded only as necessary, with almost inaudible monosyllables, signing papers that she didn't even bother to read, accepting the solid gold ring with precious stones that weighed on her finger like a shackle, receiving the religious blessing and the title she would now carry. She was officially married, legally bound to a man who was practically a stranger. At the end of the ceremony, which seemed to last an eternity and at the same time pass too quickly, the sheik approached her with slow but sure steps, bent down slightly, and kissed her hand with dry, hot lips. Ayla remained completely still, like a marble statue, not even blinking when he raised his eyes to meet hers and said, with a smile that did not reach his eyes, "You are even more beautiful than they promised me." The words, spoken in perfect French, made her feel a wave of nausea rise in her throat, and it took all her self-control not to show the physical revulsion she was experiencing. Later, as dusk fell, Ayla was led through a narrow and winding corridor of the palace, a path that seemed deliberately labyrinthine to disorient her even more. They passed through heavy carved wooden doors, thick velvet curtains that muffled any sound, and a silent internal garden where the water from a small fountain was the only perceptible noise. The air was perfumed with essences of jasmine and amber, but for Ayla, it was as if she was being suffocated by those intense aromas that tried to mask the reality of what was about to happen. The maids who accompanied her kept their eyes down, avoiding any eye contact that could reveal compassion or complicity. Their steps were silent on the colorful mosaics of the floor, as if they were ghosts accustomed to leading young wives to their inevitable destinies. Finally, they arrived before a golden door with elaborate carvings that represented scenes of hunting and conquest, a cruel metaphor for what awaited on the other side. "This is your wing, Lady Ayla," informed one of the maids in a monotonous voice, as if she were reciting a text rehearsed countless times. Ayla felt her heart race even faster, if that was possible, and gathered the courage to ask the question that tormented her. "And Mr. Tarik?" The answer came immediately, without hesitation. "He will come later, as tradition dictates." Tradition. That word was being used to justify everything, from her sale disguised as marriage to what would happen that night. The door closed with a soft but definitive click, and Ayla found herself alone in that luxurious room that would be the setting for her sacrifice. She walked slowly through the space, observing every detail as if she were memorizing the setting of a nightmare. The high ceiling with delicate frescoes, the silk-covered walls, the dark wood furniture carved by hand, the immense bed covered by Egyptian cotton sheets, and pillows embroidered with gold threads. Everything exuded wealth, power, and a secular tradition that now imprisoned her. Ayla lay down on the bed she did not choose, that she did not want, with her heart beating too hard to allow any rest, thinking only of one thing that tormented her like a repetitive mantra. Will this night really happen? Is there no way to escape? The room was silent, too big, too cold, despite the desert heat seeping through the tall windows with elaborate lattice work. The decor was luxurious, but completely devoid of soul or human warmth. Gilded furniture that seemed never to have been actually used, heavy curtains that blocked natural light and created unsettling shadows in the corners, and a huge mirror strategically positioned in front of the bed, as if it were a silent observer ready to witness her humiliation. Everything seemed designed to impress or intimidate, not to welcome. Ayla was sitting on the edge of the bed, her heart racing like a caged animal trying to escape, and her feet so cold they didn't seem to belong to her body. Her hands trembled uncontrollably on her knees, and she watched them with a strange detachment, as if they belonged to someone else. She felt a desperate urge to flee, to run in any direction that would take her away from there, but the cruel reality was that there was nowhere to go. She was in a foreign country, without her own money, without documents, without knowing the local language or geography, completely dependent on the generosity of her new husband. It was when the door opened without any prior warning that Ayla felt time freeze. Two maids entered with silent steps, heads bowed, carrying scented towels and aromatic oils. They didn't ask permission to enter. They didn't introduce themselves. They just said in mechanical voices that seemed rehearsed, "The lady needs to bathe." and wear the clothes that have been left for tonight." It wasn't a request. It was an order disguised as protocol. Ayla didn't answer, didn't move a single muscle, but the women already knew the way and what should be done. They prepared the bath in the marble tub adjacent to the room, left a fine, almost transparent piece of clothing in sight, carefully arranged on a velvet divan. It wasn't a nightgown. It was a delivery, a final wrapping for the gift she represented. "Mr. Tarik will come soon," one of them said without any emotion in her voice, as if she were commenting on the weather. "He likes everything to be as tradition dictates." Tradition, that's what they called what was about to happen, as if giving it a respectable name could transform violence into acceptable custom. Ayla entered the bath as if she were walking to her own sacrifice, each step on the cold marble of the bathroom echoing the sentence she felt had been decreed on her life. The hot water that filled the immense tub, perfumed with exotic oils that were supposed to relax, only increased her sense of unreality, as if she were floating in a bad dream from which she couldn't wake up. She washed her body in silence, mechanically, watching the foam slide over her young skin, as if it were detaching from herself, leaving behind the Ayla she knew to give way to the obedient wife that Tarik expected to find. Each touch was a silent farewell to her own autonomy, to her right to choose who would touch her, when and how. She put on the light, almost invisible garment that the maids had left on the divan, a fine silk that barely covered her body, leaving her long legs exposed and marking every curve with a transparency that made her feel completely exposed, vulnerable. It wasn't a nightgown to sleep in. It was a garment to be seen, to be consumed by the gaze of the man who had bought her. Back in the room, she sat down again on the edge of the bed, her hands crossed over her lap in a futile attempt to protect herself. There was no sheet that could cover the shame she felt. There was not enough air in that immense room to fill her lungs that seemed to have shrunk. The giant mirror reflected her fragile and semi-naked image, and Ayla looked away, unable to face the figure she saw there, a stranger dressed to please, stripped of her own will. The minutes dragged on like hours, each second marked by the almost imperceptible ticking of an old clock somewhere in the palace, a sound that seemed to mock her growing anxiety. The silence was heavy, dense, broken only by the sound of her own short breath and the uncontrolled beating of her heart against her ribs. Then he arrived. The sound of the doorknob turning slowly echoed in the silence of the room like a muffled gunshot, a harbinger of what was to come. Ayla cringed instinctively, although she didn't physically move, feeling every muscle in her body tense in anticipation and dread. Tarik entered slowly, closing the door behind him. Unhurriedly, like a predator who knows his prey has nowhere to run. He wore traditional dark silk attire. His freshly shaven face exuded a strong, woody perfume that invaded the room and seemed to suffocate Ayla even more. His eyes, dark and experienced, locked onto her with a hungry intensity, running over her semi-naked body with a cold and possessive assessment that made her feel like an object on display. He walked to the bed with measured steps, stopping before her as one approaches a newly acquired property. A slow smile formed on his thin lips, a smile that conveyed no warmth, only satisfaction and power. "You are beautiful," he said, his voice hoarse with contained desire, breaking the tense silence. Ayla did not respond, unable to form words, her gaze fixed on a random point on the Persian rug that covered the floor. He tilted his face slightly, his voice now low and sharp, charged with unquestionable authority. "Take off your clothes." The silence that followed was heavy, laden with tension. "Now," he repeated, his tone firmer, with no room for disobedience. "I want to see what's mine." Ayla swallowed hard, feeling tears burn her eyes, but she held them back. With trembling hands, which could barely obey her brain's command, she untied the delicate ties of the fine fabric. The silk slid down her shoulders, falling onto the bed in a shimmering pool, leaving her completely naked before him. She stood, exposed under Tarik's penetrating gaze, her eyes fixed on the floor, feeling every inch of her skin burn with shame and humiliation. "Lie down," he ordered, his voice still low, but charged with an authority that allowed no hesitation. "With your legs wide open, as a wife should be on her wedding night, and don't make me repeat myself." Each word was like a physical blow, delivered with precision to break any trace of resistance that might exist within her. Ayla climbed into bed slowly, her movements slow and hesitant, as if her body refused to obey. She lay down on the cold sheets, turning her face to the wall, unable to face the mirror that reflected the humiliating scene or the man who was now approaching. Her heart beat desperately against her ribs, a frantic drum announcing the imminent terror. Tarik watched her in silence for a moment, his chest rising and falling heavily, his eyes gleaming with an almost feverish anticipation that disgusted her deeply. He climbed into bed with calculated slowness, the weight of his body sinking the mattress beside her, increasing the feeling of imprisonment. He came closer, the strong scent of his perfume mixing with the fear emanating from her, and then he spoke, his voice now a hoarse whisper near her ear. "I'm going to tell you exactly what's going to happen." Ayla held her breath, her whole body tense, waiting for the next order, the next humiliation. "It's going to hurt," he continued, savoring each word. "And you're not going to move. You're not going to flinch. You're not going to scream. You can bite the sheet if you need to, but once I start, I'm not going to stop." A solitary tear, hot and silent, ran down the corner of Ayla's eye, tracing a damp path on her temple before being lost in the pillow. She didn't blink, her face remained turned to the dark wall, but her muscles trembled involuntarily, betraying the terror that consumed her from within. She felt his body moving, the heat radiating from him, the oppressive presence filling the entire space. Tarik lowered himself further, his face brushing against her hair, his breath hot on the back of her neck. He spoke close to her ear now, his tone laden with raw desire and explicit domination, as if he were narrating a script he himself had written and that she was obliged to follow. "You're going to let it happen," he whispered, his voice vibrating with an excitement that churned her insides. "You're going to open up without fighting, without resisting. You were made for this, Ayla. You were created to obey, to serve, to endure. And you will endure. Completely." Each word was a sharp knife stabbing into her soul, destroying any illusion of dignity she might still have had. Ayla didn't respond, couldn't respond. Her whole body was cold, paralyzed by fear, her gaze lost in the shadows dancing on the ceiling, her soul wandering far away, seeking refuge in some distant memory of freedom, of childhood, of a time when her body and her will still belonged to her. She tried to focus on the pattern of the silk that lined the wall, on the golden lines that formed abstract designs, on anything that would distract her from the physical and overwhelming presence of the man beside her. But it was useless. Reality was inescapable, present in his weight on the bed, in his scent in the air, in his breath on her skin. Tarik positioned himself between her legs with deliberate slowness, pushing them apart with firm hands, ignoring the tremor that ran through her body. He lowered his body over hers, the crushing weight pressing her against the mattress. He pressed his face into her neck, deeply inhaling the scent of her young skin, a possessive gesture that made her feel even more like an object. And then, he whispered in a hoarse voice, almost a grunt of anticipation, "Let's get this over with. I'm eager to possess you as soon as possible." But before Tarik could make any move to consummate the act, something unexpected happened. He stopped abruptly, his breathing faltered, becoming a short, suffocated gasp. His eyes, previously fixed on her with predatory desire, widened in shock and confusion, then rolled upwards, losing focus, as if the lights had gone out inside. His body stiffened for a second, becoming completely locked in an unnatural tension. His muscles contracted as if they had received an electric shock, and then, as suddenly as he stopped, he collapsed, heavy, limp, without any reaction, like a puppet whose strings had been cut. His entire body fell on top of Ayla, crushing her under his inert weight. His head pressed hard against her shoulder, making it difficult for her to breathe, an arm thrown across her stomach disconcertingly, the warmth of his breath disappearing quickly, replaced by a deadly silence. Ayla remained motionless for a moment, too shocked to understand what was happening, feeling only the crushing weight and the sudden absence of movement, of intention. Tarik whispered something almost voiceless, an unintelligible word perhaps. Nothing. Or perhaps it was just a final sigh, an escape of air before absolute silence. Ayla remained motionless for a moment that seemed like an eternity, her brain trying to process the abrupt change of scenery. The man who seconds before had threatened her with violation now lay inert on top of her, a dead and disconcerting weight. She tried to push him off, using the little strength she had left in her arms, but he was too heavy, a large flaccid body that barely moved. She managed to shift his torso a few centimeters, enough to release some of the pressure on her chest and allow her to breathe more deeply, but she was still trapped under him, suffocating with the unwanted touch, with the grotesque scene, with the terror that now mixed with an overwhelming confusion. His scent, once strong and dominant, now seemed only the odor of a body that was beginning to cool. Panic finally broke through the barrier of shock, and Ayla began to scream, her voice hoarse and weak at first, then gaining strength with despair. "Help!" she screamed, the word tearing through the oppressive silence of the room. "Help! Help!" The screams echoed through the silent corridor, and in seconds, the golden door burst open. The two maids who had prepared her for that night ran in, their faces pale with fright, and let out sharp screams when they saw the scene. The sheikh fallen on the bed, the young wife half-naked trapped under him. Right behind them, two burly guards dressed in discreet uniforms stormed into the room with weapons in hand, ready for a threat that did not exist in the way they imagined. Confusion quickly set in, a whirlwind of movements and overlapping voices. One of the guards, acting with speed and brute force, pulled the sheikh's inert body off Ayla, dragging him to the side of the bed with a dull thud. The other guard, perhaps out of protective instinct or to prevent the scene from becoming even more scandalous, quickly grabbed a silk sheet from the floor and covered Ayla's naked body, enveloping her like a protective but also imprisoning cocoon. The room, once a silent stage for an impending act of violence, transformed into a chaos of shouted orders in Arabic, hurried footsteps, and the palpable tension of the unexpected. Doctors were urgently called, their professional voices trying to impose some order as they examined Tarik's motionless body. The hallway outside filled with more voices, more footsteps, worried whispers, and curious glances from the few employees who dared to approach. Ayla was quickly taken away, still wrapped in the sheet, pale as wax, her wide eyes fixed on a distant point, in a state of deep shock. She couldn't cry, she couldn't speak, she couldn't even tremble. She felt only a brutal emptiness, a complete disconnection from reality, as if the world had suddenly extinguished its colors and sounds, leaving only a low, constant hum in her ears. She was taken to another room, equally luxurious, but now seeming even colder and more impersonal. They left her alone again, sitting on the edge of another unfamiliar bed, the sheets still enveloping her body like an improvised shroud, lost in a limbo of uncertainty, not knowing what had happened to Tarik, what her own fate would be, or whether that surreal night had really come to an end, or just changed shape. Hours later, Ayla learned the truth through whispers exchanged between the maids, who now treated her with a mixture of compassion and superstition. Tarik had suffered a very serious, fulminating, and irreversible stroke. He was in a deep coma, kept alive only by sophisticated equipment, rushed in from European hospitals, without any significant neurological reaction, without hope of recovery. The doctors were clear in their diagnosis. He would not return. For the next 3 months, Ayla lived in a strange limbo inside the palace. She couldn't leave. She had no contact with the outside world. She was treated as if she still belonged to Tarik, even with him unconscious in a medical wing specially set up in another sector of the palace. She lived under constant surveillance, in a gilded confinement that was not exactly a declared prison, but neither was it freedom. Meals continued to be served on fine china. Clothes continued to be changed daily. The internal gardens remained available for her solitary walks, but everything was controlled, observed, reported. She was the sheikh's wife, a position that now carried even more mystery and speculation among the palace staff. Some looked at her with fear, as if she had some supernatural power that had brought down a powerful man. Others watched her with suspicion, as if they suspected some elaborate plan. Most treated her with a respectful distance that seemed more like fear. Ayla spent her days in a monotonous and solitary routine, reading the few books in Spanish or English that she found in the palace library, walking through the internal gardens when allowed, watching the sky, through the barred windows of her rooms, and mainly waiting for news, waiting for a decision about her fate. waiting for someone to tell her what would happen now that the man who had bought her could no longer claim his property. Until, on a particularly stifling morning, when the air seemed too heavy to breathe, a maid entered her room with an expressionless face and said only, without any perceptible emotion, "Mr. Tarik passed away tonight." On the bedside table, the maid left a sealed envelope with the official seal of the Ibn Hashid family. It was the will, or at least the part that concerned her. Ayla, the wife he never came to possess, had been named partial heir to a fortune she could barely comprehend the size of. No one ever explicitly mentioned what happened that night, and she never told anyone the details of what she lived through, or almost lived through, because that was, in every possible sense, the night that never happened. The burial was discreet, almost secret, without the pomp one would expect for a man of such influence. No cameras, no elaborate speeches, just a quick and efficient ceremony, surrounded by strict security and an almost palpable silence. Ayla was not allowed to attend, even though she was officially the widow, even though she was legally the wife. Her presence would be an inconvenient reminder of a union that many preferred to forget, or, at least, not discuss openly. The day after the funeral, Tarik's chief lawyer appeared at the palace, wearing an impeccable dark suit, leather briefcase in hand, an indecipherable expression on his face aged by decades of corporate secrets. "The will was officially opened this morning," he said without unnecessary detours, getting straight to the point with the professional coldness that characterized all legal matters in that family. "And you are in it, as you must already know." Ayla didn't even react, her face as expressionless as the lawyer's. She didn't know if this was an unexpected prize or a curse disguised as benevolence. The clause in the marriage contract was clear and unequivocal. The marriage had to be consummated for any inheritance rights to be legally validated. But no one knew for sure what really happened that fateful night, and Tarik never had the chance to speak out, preferring the eternal silence of death, a silence that, for many, said everything, or perhaps nothing. What no one expected, however, was what came next. In absolute secrecy, protected by confidentiality clauses that not even his children knew about, Tarik had left a personal testamentary clause, guaranteeing Ayla a considerable part of his fortune, properties in different countries, shares in diversified companies, a generous lifetime allowance, all within the legal margin allowed by the complex Moroccan inheritance law. It was an individual decision, calculated meticulously and technically irrevocable, as long as certain conditions were maintained. Ayla couldn't understand if this was a genuine gift or an elaborate trap. Perhaps Tarik's final way of saying, "You will carry my name forever, with or without love, with or without desire, and the whole world will know it." But for Tarik's sons and daughters, many already older than Ayla herself, this was not just an unpleasant surprise, it was an unforgivable insult. On the same day that news about the inheritance spread through the family's inner circles, the systematic attacks began. Notes were strategically leaked to the international press. Articles questioning Ayla's humble origins began to appear in respected financial publications. Rumors about witchcraft, calculated seduction, and psychological manipulation circulated in the salons of Arab high society. The carefully constructed narrative was always the same. She was only there for financial gain, had somehow deceived a powerful and experienced man just to get her hands on a fortune she didn't deserve. The young Spanish woman, who became a millionaire widow in less than 3 months, the sensationalist headlines said, completely ignoring the real circumstances of that forced union. Ayla remained in absolute silence in the face of the media storm. She gave no interviews, made no public appearances, and did not try to defend her reputation. But that did not stop her image, often created from old and decontextualized photos, from becoming the target of public scrutiny and judgment. Tarik's family, united for the first time in decades by a common enemy, summoned the best lawyers in the Arab and European world, initiating an aggressive lawsuit to annul the will. They claimed that the patriarch was sick, vulnerable, and mentally compromised when he made that decision, that he had been manipulated by a young opportunist, and mainly, this was the central argument, that the marriage consummation clause had not been fulfilled, thus invalidating any right of Ayla to the inheritance. "This inheritance is a disgrace to our family and a stain on our father's memory," declared one of Tarik's eldest daughters in an exclusive interview with a Dubai television channel, not hiding the contempt in her voice. This woman stole what was rightfully ours, and we will not rest until justice is done. But nothing caused more tension and apprehension in the palace than the news that arrived 2 weeks after the funeral. Zahir was returning. Tarik's youngest son, with a degree in international law from the prestigious University of London, had been absent for more than 5 years. Voluntarily distanced from the family business and palace intrigues, he was known to be discreet, extremely intelligent, and, when necessary, ruthless. He will not rest until he clears his father's name, the oldest employees whispered in the corridors. Ayla heard that news on television, sitting alone on the sofa in her suite in the palace, with the windows closed and heavy curtains blocking the sunlight, while the world seemed to collapse around her. She knew, with a certainty that came from the survival instinct she had developed in recent months, that what would follow would not be just another lawsuit or media attack. It would be a personal war, and she was the main target.